Welcome to another quiet journey into the past. Tonight, I would like you to settle back, sink into your pillow, and let your eyelids grow heavy. We won't chase kings on horseback, nor chart the rise and fall of empires. Instead, we're slipping quietly into the less glamorous side of history, the sticky, smelly, oddly entertaining world of medieval hygiene. And our focus: the royal women of the Middle Ages, queens, duchesses, princesses, ladies who ruled courts, inspired songs, and married kings, but who may not have smelled quite as fresh as the fairy tales suggest. But before we begin, please like, share, and subscribe if you truly enjoy what I do here. Also, drop a line in the comment section below to let me know what part of the world you're listening from. It's always amazing to know that I'm helping people from near and far. Sit back, relax, and enjoy. Picture a grand hall filled with tapestries, gold cups, and music. A queen sweeps in, draped in velvet, pearls woven into her hair. But lean closer, and the perfume cloud surrounding her isn't just for luxury, it's for survival. You see, bathing was not considered necessary. In fact, some physicians of the time believed that too much water on the skin could let sickness in. So, instead of soap and water, the royal ladies often doused themselves with rosewater, lavender oil, or even vinegar mixed with herbs. Their gowns smelled like gardens in bloom. But beneath the perfume? That was another matter entirely. Now imagine the royal hair. Long, braided, and decorated with ribbons and jewels. But washed? Not very often. Hair was believed to be vulnerable to illness if soaked too much, so instead, women sprinkled powders, made of crushed flowers, spices, or even flour, to absorb oils and give the illusion of cleanliness. White, powdered roots were the fashion, though they sometimes looked as if a loaf of bread had exploded on their heads. And yes, lice thrived in these majestic locks. Lice combs made of ivory or bone were prized possessions. A queen could sit for hours as a maid carefully picked through her braids. Imagine that. Royal grooming as a medieval sleep aid. You might assume royal women wore something soft and comfortable beneath their gowns. But in fact, underwear wasn't the standard. Many noble women simply layered gowns and shifts, which absorbed sweat and were occasionally washed. This meant that laundry day was less about small clothes and more about giant heaps of linen shifts soaked in lye. A smelly business. And yet, in winter, extra layers also meant warmth. Perhaps discomfort and odour were the price of surviving the draughty stone castles. Ah, the royal smile. Surely queens flashed gleaming pearls. Well, not quite. Medieval sugar was a luxury, reserved for nobles. And they used it liberally: sugared almonds, candied fruits, honey cakes. Royal women loved sweet treats, but dental hygiene lagged far behind. Tooth powders made of crushed eggshells, burnt rosemary, or even ground-up animal bones were used when available. But many noble ladies suffered rotting teeth, blackened gums, and constant toothaches. Picture a dazzling queen attempting to hide her wince while biting into a candied fig. And what of bathrooms? Royal castles boasted guardrabes, stone closets built into the walls where waste dropped down a chute. But in truth, many ladies preferred to use a private chamber pot, a decorated bowl tucked under the bed or chair. Maids were tasked with the delightful chore of emptying them. One can only imagine the odours wafting through fine bedchambers filled with silks and jewels. Royalty, it seems, did not smell like roses after all. Some remedies border on the comical. Records tell us that noblewomen sometimes gargled with wine to freshen their breath. Yes, a little swish of claret or spiced mead, and suddenly one smelled healthier. Others chewed parsley or fennel seeds. And, in a particularly unfortunate recipe, some healers recommended rinsing with urine. Supposedly, it whitened teeth. A bedtime thought that might make you clutch your toothbrush a little tighter tonight. Here's a curious note. Sweating was thought to purify the body. So instead of washing dirt away, women sometimes wore heavy gowns and sat near the fire to sweat it out. The damp linens underneath could be peeled off, and, voila, a kind of cleanliness. Modern ears may cringe, But in draughty castles, wrapped in wool and fur, perhaps it was the closest thing to a spa day. Life beyond the royal chambers was no fresher. Markets bustled with unwashed crowds, streets ran with waste, and animals shared the roads. Even queens had to breathe the same air. They often carried pomanders, small balls of scented herbs, to hold near their noses when the stench became unbearable, a medieval version of a pocket air freshener. As we wander deeper into this medieval world, let us pause and peek into a queen's morning routine, or rather, what passed for one. Forget bubble baths or steaming showers. A royal lady's day might begin with her ladies-in-waiting bringing a basin of water, just a basin, a splash on the face, a dab on the hands, perhaps a cloth rubbed over the neck. This was thought sufficient. Water was risky, they said. It could carry disease. The skin must be protected, not drenched. So instead of bathing, powders and perfumes were liberally applied. Imagine flower dust swirling through the air as hair was dusted, gowns refreshed, and skin patted down. The room may have looked like a baker's workshop after a busy morning. Now, about those gowns. They were rarely washed. A velvet dress, embroidered with jewels and heavy golden thread, could not simply be dunked in soapy water. Instead, layers of linen shifts beneath absorbed the sweat. These were occasionally laundered, but the grand gowns themselves. They were aired out, hung in a draught, shaken a bit, and sprinkled with herbs. Rosemary was a favourite, believed to ward off illness as well as stench. A noblewoman stepping into a hall might smell faintly of a kitchen roast, a bread loaf, and a herb garden all at once. And here's something amusing. When women wore their many layers, the weight alone could be astonishing. Imagine trudging through a draughty corridor, 10 or 12 pounds of fabric swishing about, the shifts, the underskirts, the gown, the outer robe, all absorbing, trapping and mingling scents of the day. Did it feel regal, or did it feel like a mobile laundry basket? Perhaps both. Hair care was another adventure. Combs, as mentioned, were essential tools. Many were carved from bone or ivory, decorated so beautifully that they looked more like jewellery than practical instruments. Yet their job was simple: to drag through tangles, to remove lice, and to catch the eggs that clung stubbornly to strands. There are even records of entire court sessions where women sat chatting, gossiping, while servants carefully combed their hair. A lice-picking salon, one might say. And then there was the crown. Crowns were rarely perched directly on the head. Instead, hair was carefully padded, braided, and arranged in elaborate shapes to hold the royal accessory. With so much oil, powder, and perfume involved, one wonders if a crown sometimes smelled like a potpourri basket, or perhaps like something left a little too long in a pantry. Teeth, of course, continued to be a royal tragedy. We know that Elizabeth I of England, though not medieval but later, was mocked for her blackened teeth from sugar. And yet the trend began much earlier. To have access to sugar was a mark of wealth, so to display its effects, even rotten teeth, could bizarrely be considered fashionable. "See," the noblewoman might say with a smile, "I am rich enough to ruin my mouth." Chamber pots deserve another moment of thought. They were not only practical but sometimes extravagantly decorated, gold-trimmed, painted with flowers, fitted with lids. Imagine the paradox: a pot as beautiful as a jewel box, yet carrying something decidedly less glamorous inside. Servants bore them away, down into the dark corners of the castle, where waste joined the general refuse. And yes, even in palaces, the smell lingered. Royalty and rats were closer companions than the songs of chivalry admit. And then, the strangest of medical advice. Physicians often instructed noblewomen to avoid bathing during certain phases of the moon. Bathing, they warned, might weaken the womb or cause illness to seep in through the pores. Instead, women were told to wrap themselves in cloths soaked in vinegar, believing the sharp smell would drive away both disease and foul odour. Rooms filled with the sting of vinegar and the sweetness of flowers must have smelled like a salad gone wrong. Not only did perfumes and powders mask smells, they were also symbols of refinement. To own a bottle of rosewater imported from distant lands was a statement of status. And yet, behind the cloud of roses, a royal lady's armpit might be crying out for mercy. Servants, forever close by, surely noticed. But etiquette demanded silence. Of course, one could not discuss medieval hygiene without mentioning the curious obsession with bloodletting. While not exactly a hygiene practice, it was linked to ideas of bodily balance and health. Noblewomen would sometimes be bled as part of purification. The belief was that excess blood carried illness. So, while bathing was avoided, releasing a pint of blood was considered entirely sensible. It is enough to make modern ears twitch in disbelief. Beyond the walls of the royal chamber, the larger world smelled no sweeter. Castles often had open ditches where waste was dumped. Rivers running through towns carried filth from both markets and kitchens. Even the finest castles could not fully escape the odours of their time. A queen, perfumed and powdered, would walk across courtyards where pigs snuffled at scraps and dogs roamed freely. The contrast must have been overwhelming. Jewelled slippers and mud, silk gowns and manure. And yet, in their own way, these women adapted. Pomanders were the trendiest accessories, small, often golden balls that opened to reveal scented herbs. A lady might hold one near her nose, shielding herself from the air around her. In crowded banquets filled with sweaty guests and greasy food, the pomander was salvation. Think of it as a medieval face mask, except far more stylish. When we imagine a medieval queen, we often see her seated high upon a dais, wrapped in silks and jewels, her every movement admired by courtiers. But if we slip closer, beyond the illusion of polished marble and glittering crowns, we find something very human and rather less charming: the matter of hygiene. In those candlelit halls, beneath layers of velvet, lace and fur, the royal women lived by practices that to our modern senses feel downright peculiar, occasionally comical, and sometimes stomach-turning. Yet for them, these habits were not signs of neglect, but of care, wisdom, and social grace. What we might wrinkle our noses at, they treated as tradition, medical necessity, or even fashion. Consider first the curious relationship between water and health. Today we splash water on our faces without hesitation, rinse our hands dozens of times a day, and sink gratefully into baths. But to a medieval noblewoman, bathing was a dangerous prospect. Physicians of the time warned that hot water could open the pores, leaving the body vulnerable to illness, while cold water was thought to shock the humours out of balance. For this reason, most women did not immerse themselves fully. Instead, they might stand by a basin, dip a cloth in water scented with herbs, and dab the skin here and there. A queen's morning wash might take only minutes, producing more fragrance than freshness. To us, it may sound like a perfumed shortcut, but to them, it was careful self-preservation. They believed they were guarding their bodies against invisible sickness. Their hair, often long and elaborately styled, tells another tale of medieval priorities. A noblewoman's locks could be her pride, yet water rarely touched them. Instead, powders were shaken through, sometimes made from crushed rose petals, sometimes from orris root, and quite often simply from flour or chalk. These powders absorbed oil, gave a pale, fashionable sheen, and carried the pleasant suggestion of freshness. But the truth beneath the surface was less delightful. Hair crawled with lice, and lice combs were constant companions. Some were carved from ivory, others from wood, their teeth close together to catch both insect and egg. Imagine a courtly scene where gossip and politics drifted across the room, while in a quieter corner a queen sat patiently as her ladies worked a comb through her braids. This ritual was not a one-time affair, but a steady rhythm of life, a reminder that even power and wealth could not drive out tiny, persistent companions. Clothing, too, was both glamorous and grim. A gown of velvet or brocade, embroidered with pearls, could cost a fortune and display status more effectively than words. Yet such garments were not laundered. Their intricate stitching, delicate silks, and costly adornments would be ruined by soap and water. Instead, the linen shift worn beneath absorbed sweat and oils from the body, acting as a protective barrier. It was this underlayer, not the outer gown, that met the washtub. And so, shifts were scrubbed with lye, beaten against stones, and hung to dry in cold breezes, while gowns were merely shaken out, brushed, and perfumed. To walk into a hall of ladies was to step into a garden of competing scents, rosemary and lavender, mint and sage, and beneath it all, a musk of fabric that had travelled through many days without washing. It must have been both dazzling and overwhelming, a perfume cloud that cloaked the reality beneath. The royal mouth held its own secrets. Teeth, even among the highest born, suffered from indulgence. Sugar was expensive, rare, and treasured, but where it appeared, it was used liberally. Candied almonds, honeyed cakes, spiced wine thick with sweetness, all found their way into the royal diet. The result, of course, was decay. Records from the later medieval and Tudor periods show noblewomen smiling with teeth blackened and pitted. Yet strangely, this did not always invite shame. For some, it was a sign of wealth. To afford enough sugar to ruin one's teeth was proof of luxury. To clean them, women might rub the surface with cloth dipped in vinegar, or powders made from burnt rosemary, salt, or even ground oyster shells. Imagine the grittiness of such a paste, the sting of vinegar on tender gums, the faint improvement that lasted only until the next honey cake. And then there were the most private of matters, whispered about, but never written in court poetry, the chamber pot. Every grand lady's chamber had one, often beautifully decorated, painted with flowers or adorned with gilded handles. Yet, for all their beauty, their purpose was humbler than humble. Servants carried them away, down dark staircases, to be emptied into pits or streams. The garderobe, those narrow little stone rooms built into castle walls, provided another option, though hardly more refined. Waste dropped down a shaft into a moat or ditch, sometimes splattering onto walls or stones below. Imagine a queen pausing in her stately robe, lifting her skirts in a cramped stone alcove and hearing the unceremonious splash beneath. It is not the image sung about in medieval ballads, but it is the reality that lived alongside crowns and jewels. Even cosmetics bore traces of strange hygiene. To pale the skin, women sometimes used powders made from lead or mercury, substances that would horrify us now. To rouge their cheeks, they might dab on crushed berries, the sticky sweetness mingling with perfume and sweat. Kohl lined the eyes, ground from minerals, dark and smudgy. Each addition was meant to display refinement, but each carried its own hazards, lead poisoning, rashes, or infections. Beauty, like cleanliness, was a matter of illusion more than substance. A queen might appear radiant in a candlelit hall, but the scent of vinegar, rosewater, sweat, and smoke followed her closely. And if all this sounds unpleasant, imagine too the wider castle environment. The kitchens, vast and smoky, reeked of roasting meat, of spilled ale, of fish brought fresh from rivers and left too long on tables. The stables lay close by, with hay, manure, and restless horses adding their own aroma. Courtyards bustled with dogs, chickens, pigs rooting in scraps. Even the grandest castles were living, breathing farms enclosed in stone. No scented pomander could entirely blot out this chorus of smells. Yet noblewomen carried their pomanders everywhere, little golden cages filled with cloves, cinnamon, or dried roses. They lifted them to their noses in crowded halls, in markets and on journeys, a small shield of sweetness against the reality of medieval life. Strangest of all were the remedies prescribed for health and cleanliness. Gargling with wine was common, thought to kill harmful humours and freshen breath. Chewing parsley or fennel seeds was said to sweeten it further. More dubious recipes suggested rinsing with urine, praised for its supposed whitening powers. Physicians swore by it, ladies endured it, and we, at the safe distance of centuries, can only shake our heads in disbelief. Yet these practices were woven into the rhythm of noble life. They believed in them, trusted them, and passed them on as wisdom. Childbirth, that most private of experiences, had its own curious set of hygiene practices in the medieval world. Royal women, whose children might inherit kingdoms, endured it surrounded by rituals and beliefs that seem strange today. The birthing chamber was often sealed, literally. Windows shuttered, doors closed, curtains drawn, no fresh air allowed. Physicians and midwives warned that draughts of air could harm both mother and child, slipping in like invisible demons. Instead of cleanliness and circulation, the air grew thick with smoke from candles and braziers, heavy with sweat, herbs, and the cloying sweetness of perfumed cloths. A queen in labour would breathe this dense atmosphere for hours, perhaps days, her attendants fanning her with sprigs of herbs to purify the air while whispering prayers for safe delivery. Water was rarely used to wash or refresh her. Instead, cloths dipped in wine or vinegar were dabbed upon the skin, and once the child was born, swaddled tight in layers, both mother and infant might not see water for many days. To us it seems suffocating, but to them it was protection, a cocoon against unseen forces. And then there were public bathhouses, which carried their own contradictions. In some towns, even noble women ventured to these places, though rarely without anxiety. Bathhouses were seen as both beneficial and dangerous. On one hand, warm water soothed the body, loosened stiff muscles, and eased the burdens of childbearing. On the other hand, moralists warned that bathhouses were dens of sin, where men and women might mingle improperly. For royal women to visit a bathhouse was rare, perhaps only on a physician's recommendation, and always in private chambers when possible. A queen might sit in a carved wooden tub lined with linen sheets, the water heated and poured in by servants. Herbs like sage or chamomile floated on the surface. The experience might feel luxurious, even healing. Yet, soon after, she would be wrapped in cloths and told to rest, lest the dangerous open pores invite illness. What we would see as the beginning of hygiene, they saw as a flirtation with danger. Menstruation carried its own shadows of secrecy and discomfort. Royal women, like all women, relied on linen cloths, often reused and carefully washed by servants. But superstition surrounded the cycle. Some believed menstrual blood was toxic, capable of wilting crops or sickening animals. Others whispered that a menstruating woman should not prepare food or touch sacred objects. For a queen, these taboos created isolation. Attendants managed the cloths discreetly, laundering them in guarded corners of the castle, while the queen herself endured the discomfort under heavy gowns. No perfumes or powders could fully disguise the realities of nature. And yet, this too was wrapped in ritual. Some physicians advised special diets, extra herbs, or prayers to ease the process, none of which we would call effective today. Cosmetics, meant to beautify, often worsened matters. Pale skin was prized, the mark of a woman who did not labour in fields under the sun. To achieve it, noble women dusted their faces with powders of lead or mercury, unaware of the slow poisoning it caused. Cheeks were rouged with crushed berries, lips reddened with cochineal or even with mixtures that included animal fat. The effect was striking under candlelight, but close inspection might reveal rashes, sores, or peeling skin. And still they continued, for beauty was more than vanity, it was politics. A queen's face was her emblem, displayed at court, immortalized in portraits, judged by ambassadors. To be beautiful was to be powerful, even if the price was years of hidden suffering. Imagine the irony. A queen seated in silks, speaking with grace and authority, her smile painted bright red, while beneath the surface, her skin quietly burned from the very substances meant to glorify it. We cannot forget the perfumes themselves, those heavy veils that cloaked the body. Rosewater was the most popular, distilled from petals in copper stills, a luxury imported at great cost. Lavender and rosemary grew closer at hand, steeped in oils and rubbed into garments. But perfumes were not only masks for odour, they were thought to guard against disease. Physicians taught that foul smells carried illness, so to surround oneself with sweetness was to erect a wall of safety. A queen might sit in her chambers, the air thick with burning incense, the floor strewn with rushes scented with herbs, her garments heavy with rosewater. To her, this was not excess, but prudence. If she sneezed less, if she felt stronger, she credited the perfume. And all the while, servants worked tirelessly, grinding herbs, sprinkling powders, and dousing fabrics to maintain the fragile illusion of cleanliness. The strangest practices often came from the physicians' manuals. Some advised women to rub crushed emeralds on their skin, believing the gemstone carried purifying powers. Others recommended ointments made from ground earthworms or animal fat to keep the body supple. A queen might be offered a paste of crushed snails for her complexion, or a draught of spiced wine mixed with powdered horn to strengthen her health. Each recipe was a blend of superstition and earnest hope, a reflection of a world where science had not yet separated itself from folklore. The result was a patchwork of rituals, some harmless, some dangerous, and many simply odd, that governed the daily hygiene of the most powerful women in Europe. Even their beds carried peculiar rules. Mattresses were often filled with straw, which grew damp and musty over time. To freshen them, servants scattered dried herbs among the stalks, mint, thyme, or lavender. It gave the illusion of a fragrant resting place, though the underlying straw still carried the scent of mildew and sweat. Noblewomen slept beneath heavy canopies of fabric, meant to keep out draughts, but which also trapped heat and odours. At night, chamber pots lingered beneath the bed, and the mingling of straw, herbs, and waste created an atmosphere not easily described as restful. And yet, this was the height of luxury. Ordinary villagers slept on wooden boards, or piles of hay on the floor. The queen, in her canopy bed, inhaling her mixture of perfumes and straw, may well have considered herself blessed. Banquets, those glittering affairs that filled castle halls with music and laughter, were not merely feasts of food, but also feasts of smells, sounds, and sights that pressed upon the senses. Imagine a long wooden table draped in linen, candles sputtering in brass holders, platters groaning under roasted swan, venison, and spiced pies. At the high table, a queen might sit, jewels glinting in her hair, her face lit by torchlight. Yet behind the magnificence lurked the inescapable truth. Hygiene was not a guest at the banquet. Fingers dipped into shared bowls, knives sliced meat passed from one person to another, and hand-washing before meals was often ceremonial rather than thorough. Guests dipped their hands into perfumed basins, dried them on shared towels, and considered the matter settled. Grease from roasted meats clung to fingers, bread crusts doubled as napkins, and bones were tossed to dogs prowling underfoot. By the time the last course of candied fruit arrived, the hall was thick with the mingled odours of food, sweat, smoke, and animals. For a queen, the solution was to sit serenely, hold her pomander close, and smile as though the room were filled with roses. Travel, too, brought its own challenges. When a royal procession moved from castle to castle, wagons creaked under the weight of gowns, jewels, and household goods. Yet there was no such wagon for fresh water or portable baths. Queens travelled with their own linens, their own perfumed sachets, and sometimes even their own chamber pots, carried discreetly by attendants. Roads were muddy, bridges unstable, and inns along the way far less refined than royal halls. To step into a lodging house was to encounter straw beds crawling with fleas, wooden floors dark with grime, and smoke-blackened walls that clung to clothes and hair. Even queens were not spared these realities. They hung their own curtains to create a semblance of privacy, laid their own scented cloths to cover filthy boards, and relied heavily on perfumes to mask the indignities of travel. A journey of 100 miles might leave a royal lady not refreshed by adventure, but weighed down by dust, smoke, and the silent misery of vermin. And yet, there were moments when noblewomen indulged in treatments that to them felt almost luxurious, though to us they might sound peculiar. Physicians and attendants recommended special baths for health not of water, but of steam or herbs. A queen might sit on a chair with holes in the seat while pots of boiling herbs released fragrant steam beneath her skirts. This was thought to cleanse and restore the womb, to balance humours, and to renew vitality. It was, in effect, a medieval spa day, though it left women dripping with sweat and smelling like a kitchen garden. Other treatments involved rubbing the skin with oil mixed with ground herbs, or placing heated stones wrapped in cloth against the body to draw out impurities. These rituals were followed with rest in bed, heavy blankets tucked around the body, while servants whispered prayers and placed pomanders nearby to keep the air pure. Whether these treatments offered any real benefit is doubtful, but for queens they were moments of care and ritual, moments that reminded them of their special place in the world. Even leisure carried reminders of hygiene, or the lack of it. After long hours in draughty halls, women sought fresh air in gardens where herbs and flowers grew in abundance. These gardens were not only for beauty, but for medicine. Queens plucked mint to chew for their breath, lavender to tuck into their gowns, and roses to press into ointments. Yet even in these serene spaces, hygiene was far from modern standards. Animals roamed freely, gardeners fertilized with manure, and water channels carried not only freshness but the remnants of kitchens upstream. Still, the sight of flowers swaying in the breeze, the buzz of bees, and the promise of a sachet of dried petals were enough to create the illusion of cleanliness and refinement. At night, after banquets and strolls, after rituals and treatments, queens returned to their chambers, where candles smoked and shadows flickered on stone walls. Servants brought warm spiced wine, thought to ease digestion and freshen the mouth, though it did little for teeth already weakened by sugar. Chamber pots were set discreetly behind screens, beds were piled with furs, and perfumed cloths were placed near pillows. The queen lay down, not in perfect cleanliness, but wrapped in layers of perfume, powders, and illusions. Sleep came slowly, in rooms filled with scents both pleasant and foul, the mingling of flowers, herbs, straw, and sweat creating a tapestry as complex as any woven in the looms of the castle. Banquets, though dazzling to the eye, were often uncomfortable for the body. Picture a hall filled with long wooden tables pressed close together, every surface crowded with trenchers, thick slabs of bread that served as plates. Grease from roasted meats soaked into these edible platters, leaving behind a soggy mess that was sometimes eaten, sometimes tossed to the dogs prowling underfoot. A queen, seated high at the head table, was expected to pick delicately, to smile at visiting ambassadors, and to sip her wine with elegance. Yet the truth was that the hall grew stifling, filled with smoke from torches, sweat from bodies, and the thick odour of food that clung to clothes and hair. The ladies in waiting behind her fanned her gently, and every so often she might raise her perfumed pomander to her nose as though inhaling roses instead of venison fat. The songs of minstrels floated above the din, but the real symphony was the crunch of bones, the barking of dogs, and the rustle of skirts brushing the rushes scattered on the floor to soak up spills. Those rushes, green when laid down, grew filthy within days, full of crumbs, grease, and insects. Yet to medieval eyes, this was not filth, but festivity, a celebration of life and abundance. Travel, when it came, was a mixture of spectacle and hardship. A royal procession stretched for miles, with wagons of clothes, servants, and provisions following the Queen's carriage. Trumpets might announce her arrival at villages, children ran to watch, and peasants knelt in the mud. But for the Queen herself, travel was exhausting. Carriages jolted over uneven roads, the wheels sinking into ruts, the air filled with dust or damp mist. Inns along the way were crude, their bedding lumpy, their rooms smoky. Even the finest chambers offered little privacy, and the air was thick with fleas. Queens often brought their own bedding, their own sheets carefully perfumed with lavender to be spread over the inn's straw pallets. Their maids hung tapestries to mask the bare walls, and censers of burning herbs were lit to purify the air. To step into such a space after a long day on the road was a relief, but also a reminder of how fragile luxury was. One gust of wind brought in the smell of stables, one servant's muddy boots trailed filth across the floor, and once again the pomander was pressed to the face. Beauty rituals occupied much of a noblewoman's time, though they were often more harmful than helpful. Pale skin was the ultimate sign of status, so women powdered their faces with mixtures of lead and vinegar. This paste left their cheeks ghostly white but also inflamed the skin, leaving sores hidden beneath the paint. To redden the lips and cheeks, they turned to crushed berries or even mixtures that included cinnabar, a mineral containing mercury. The effect in candlelight was striking, a doll-like face with bright eyes and crimson lips. But the reality was that beneath these layers, the skin suffered terribly. A queen might smile at a banquet, her beauty praised in songs and poems, while privately enduring itching, pain, or even slow poisoning from the very substances that made her radiant. Perfumes were dabbed behind the ears, on the wrists, and along the neck, leaving a trail of roses, violets, or cloves wherever she walked. These scents were not chosen only for their loveliness. They were shields, wards against disease, protection against the foul odours believed to spread sickness. For a queen, to smell sweet was not vanity, but survival. Sleep, that most ordinary of needs, was a complicated affair in the medieval royal chamber. Beds were great wooden constructions, carved with intricate designs, hung with heavy curtains. Within, straw mattresses were piled with down, covered in linen sheets and furs. To step into such a bed was to sink into warmth, but also into mustiness. Straw absorbed sweat and odours over time, and though servants added herbs to disguise the smell, mint, lavender, and thyme, it was impossible to fully escape the scent of dampness. At the side of the bed, a chamber pot waited, its presence both necessary and unpleasant. The queen, wrapped in layers of linen and wool, might drift to sleep to the sound of rats scurrying in the rafters, or the faint splash of water dripping somewhere in the stone corridors. Her dreams mingled with reality, the perfume of herbs fighting against the smell of waste and smoke. Yet for all its discomforts, this was luxury. Beyond the castle walls, peasants slept on straw pallets in crowded huts, the smell of animals and cooking fires thick in the air. The queen's chamber, heavy with silks and scents, was considered the height of refinement. Banquets returned again and again in the rhythm of her life, not every day, but often enough that the cycle of feasting and fasting shaped the body. After nights of greasy meats and sweet wines, a queen might rise with a heavy stomach, her breath carrying the scent of the feast. Remedies included chewing parsley, rinsing with wine, or swallowing bitter herbs. None truly worked, but all gave the illusion of relief. At the next feast, the pattern repeated, hands washed ceremonially, meats carved and passed, grease wiped on bread, perfumes pressed into the air. The queen's role was not to eat heartily, but to appear graceful, to show that abundance was hers to command. And so, even when food soured in the heat, when meats grew cold and waxy, when sauces curdled, she lifted her goblet and smiled, a vision of refinement amid the very smells she worked so hard to mask. Travel, too, circled back into her days, for queens rarely stayed long in one place. Castles were cold, draughty, and expensive to maintain, so the court moved frequently. Each journey meant another round of packing gowns and jewels, another parade of wagons, another night in smoky lodgings. The roads changed with the seasons, mud in spring, dust in summer, ice in winter. The queen sat in her carriage, layered in gowns, furs tucked around her, a pomander held to her nose. From time to time she glanced outside, where peasants trudged barefoot, children ran alongside, and animals plodded in the muck. For her, travel was a duty, a performance of majesty. For her attendants, it was endless toil, washing linen in streams, airing out gowns, fetching water for the perfumed basins. And always, the effort to keep up the fragile illusion of freshness. Beauty, sleep, banquets and travel formed a cycle that defined her life. Each sphere bled into the next, the perfumes of the banquet carried into the bedchamber, the fatigue of travel showing on the powdered face, the discomforts of sleep relieved only by another round of herbs and powders. To us, the contradictions are almost comic. Wealth and filth, perfume and waste, silks and lice, sugar and rotting teeth. Yet for the medieval queen, this was simply life. She knew no gleaming baths, no toothbrushes, no fresh sheets each morning. Her world was one of constant balancing, of masking, of enduring. And through it all, she carried herself with grace, believing, as her physicians and priests told her, that she was not unclean, but preserved, protected, and noble. A royal wedding, that glittering spectacle of vows and veils, was not only a union of dynasties, but also a curious experiment in medieval hygiene. Imagine a young princess sent from her family's court to marry a foreign king. Her gowns were pressed with herbs, her hair powdered, her face painted with lead-based whiteners. She arrived perfumed and adorned, yet beneath the layers, her body was just as weary from travel as any other. Weddings stretched over days of feasting, and the bride was expected to appear radiant at every moment. Before the ceremony, she might sit for hours while attendants combed her hair for lice, dabbed her with rosewater, and adjusted her veils. Bathing was not part of the preparation. Scent and powder did the work instead. Guests gathered in crowded halls, pressed shoulder to shoulder, the air heavy with sweat and food, and all the while the bride was expected to shine like a beacon of purity. And yet, once the festivities were done, she returned to her new bedchamber, where linens, herbs, and chamber pots awaited her just as in her father's court. The poetry spoke of roses and chastity, but the reality was one of perfumes and smoke mingling beneath the canopy. Sickness within a castle was an entirely different ordeal. When a plague or fever swept through, even queens were not spared the stench of illness. Physicians came with their bags of remedies, ordering fires to be lit, incense to be burned, and cloths soaked in vinegar to be hung over doorways. The queen might be told to hold a pomander filled with cloves close to her nose, to chew bitter herbs, or to swallow concoctions made from ground pearls, crushed gemstones, or animal organs. Hygiene was turned upside down in these moments. Windows were closed tight, thought to block out bad air, even as the rooms grew hotter and ranker. Water was still feared, so linen cloths were used instead of washing, and perfumes were poured more heavily than ever before. A queen walking the halls of a sickened castle was like a ghost wrapped in fragrance, her presence both reassuring and surreal. Servants whispered that her perfume could ward off death, though in truth it was only a fragile veil against the overwhelming odour of disease. Holy days and festivals brought yet another side to the cycle of hygiene. On great feast days, when the court gathered to celebrate saints or coronations, the streets were lined with processions, and queens walked beneath banners and incense smoke. People tossed flowers, crowds pressed close, and the air grew thick with the mingling scents of sweat, animals, and burning tallow candles. For the queen, preparation meant powders and perfumes once more, her gown layered and her face painted. Yet by the time she returned from the procession, her silks were heavy with dust, her shoes damp with mud, and her hair laden with the smell of smoke. Attendants hurried to shake out her gown, sprinkle her with rosewater, and change her linens, all to restore the illusion of untouched grace. Festivals that were meant to uplift the spirit often left the body weary, coated in a thin film of dirt and perfume, a reminder that celebration in the medieval world was never entirely clean. Banquets returned again, as they always did, endless rounds of meat and ale, of hand-washing that barely touched the grime, of perfumes that struggled to keep pace with the smells of the hall. Travel returned, wagons rolling along rutted roads, dust clinging to veils and cloaks. Beauty rituals returned, powders and pastes applied in dim candlelight, faces painted until they glowed unnaturally white. And sleep returned, the queen drawing her curtains, settling into straw padded with herbs, drifting off to the mingling scents of mint and mildew, roses and sweat. The cycle spun endlessly, banquets, travel, beauty, sleep, each one a dance of illusion and endurance, each one a reminder that queens, for all their power, could never escape the small indignities of their age. And through it all, queens learned to endure with poise. They knew how to smile with lips painted by crushed berries, even as their teeth ached from sugar. They knew how to glide through a banquet hall, perfumed and powdered, even as the rushes squished beneath their feet with grease and spilled ale. They knew how to hold their heads high on journeys, their veils fluttering in the wind, even as fleas stirred in the straw of their carriages. They knew how to close their eyes at night, pulling furs around them, even as the chamber pot sat quietly beneath the bed. Their lives were layered, silk upon linen, perfume upon sweat, roses upon rot. And in those layers lay the strange beauty of medieval nobility. Church, that great anchor of medieval life, demanded not only devotion but also display. A queen entering a cathedral was expected to embody piety, purity, and refinement. She stepped across worn stone floors beneath vaulted ceilings, her silks rustling, her jewels gleaming in the dim light of flickering candles. Yet preparation for such solemn occasions was not what we might imagine today. There was no bath to cleanse the skin, no careful washing of hair. Instead, her ladies powdered her face and hands, adjusted veils to conceal any imperfections, and dusted her garments with herbs to mask lingering odours. Before a grand mass, her shoes might be rubbed with perfumed oils, her gloves lined with dried lavender, her breath freshened with a sip of spiced wine. In the air of the cathedral, thick with incense, the layering of scents, frankincense, myrrh, rosewater, unwashed bodies, mingled into a haze that clung to everyone present. The queen knelt, prayed and sang, while beneath the solemnity of ritual, lice combs waited in chambers nearby, perfumes clung to her gown, and powders softened the roughness of skin long unwashed. For her, this blend of sacred and smelly was simply the rhythm of faith. The seasons added their own complications. In summer, castles grew stifling. The stone walls, meant to protect, trapped heat within. Sweat soaked through layers of linen and velvet, perfumes grew overpowering, and flies gathered near kitchens and garderobes. Queens dabbed their foreheads with cloths dipped in rosewater or held sprigs of herbs beneath their noses to ward off both heat and smell. Their maids shook out gowns in courtyards, hoping breezes would freshen them, though more often dust and smoke replaced the stale air. In winter, the problem reversed. Stone rooms grew icy, breaths fogged in the air, and heavy furs were piled on beds. To keep warm, queens layered garment upon garment, shifts and gowns and cloaks, each trapping odours beneath the wool and velvet. Washing was avoided in cold weather. Water, already distrusted, now seemed dangerous to chilled bodies. Instead, smoke from roaring fires clung to everything, saturating hair and cloth until even rosewater could not compete. Summer was stench, winter was smoke. Each season brought its own burden to mask. And then there were the attendants, those quiet figures whose labour made the illusion of cleanliness possible. Ladies in waiting combed through hair, searching for lice while whispering gossip. Maids carried chamber pots down winding stairs, their arms steady despite the unpleasant task. Servants beat linen shifts against rocks in streams, scrubbing them with harsh lye until their own hands cracked and bled. Others laid fresh herbs on floors, scattered mint, thyme and sage to disguise the smells of grease and waste. In grand ceremonies, attendants tucked pomanders into sleeves, ensuring their mistresses always had a fragrant defence against foul air. These attendants bore the truth of noble hygiene more intimately than anyone else. They saw the sores hidden beneath powders, they cleaned the gowns stiff with sweat, they combed the mats of hair powdered white with flour. Yet their silence was expected, their work was invisible. Queens were remembered for their beauty, their grace, their majesty, not for the armies of women who laboured to keep the illusion intact. At night, when the last candles sputtered low, the Queen's chamber became a world of scents and shadows. Curtains were drawn close to block draughts, though in summer the air grew heavy and stifling. Servants tucked furs around her, set bowls of herbs near her pillow, and left the pomander within reach. The Queen might lie awake for some time, listening to the creaks of the wooden beams above, the scurry of mice in the walls, the distant echo of a guard's boots in the courtyard. Beside her, the chamber pot sat discreetly beneath a bench, a reminder of life's constant practicalities. Her body, painted with powders, perfumed with oils, wrapped in linen and laid upon straw and down, drifted slowly toward rest. And when morning came, the cycle began again. Powders reapplied, perfumes refreshed, hair combed for lice, gowns shaken out, and the great dance of illusion performed once more. The cycle of banquets, travel, beauty, and sleep wove itself seamlessly into holy days, seasons, and sickness. Each one brought its own rituals, its own remedies, its own peculiar balance between filth and finery. A queen's life was not the fairy tale of sparkling gowns and radiant freshness. It was a world of constant adjustment, constant masking, constant endurance. And yet, through all of it, she held her head high, her presence shining with dignity, even if her chamber smelled faintly of vinegar, sweat, and lavender mingled together. Festivals in the medieval world were spectacles of both devotion and chaos. For a queen, these days meant not only processions and prayers, but also endurance. Picture the streets of a city lined with peasants, their clothes dusty, their bodies unwashed from weeks of toil. Bells clanged, banners waved, and incense drifted in thick clouds that mingled with the odours of the crowd. The queen, dressed in layers of velvet and brocade, jewels glinting at her temples, processed slowly beneath a canopy. Every step was a performance, every smile a statement of majesty. Yet under her gown the heat was suffocating, sweat dampened her linen shift, and perfumes fought a losing battle against the air of humanity pressing close. When she returned to her chambers, attendants shook out her skirts, fanned her with herbs, and dabbed her skin with rosewater. The crowd saw a vision of divine grace. Behind the scenes was a weary woman longing for fresh air, a clean shift, and perhaps a basin of scented water to soothe her skin. Festivals were meant to honour God and crown alike, but they left queens coated in dust, smoke, and sweat that no incense could fully disguise. Coronations carried a similar duality, glory in public, discomfort in private. On the great day, a queen was dressed in her finest robes, heavy with embroidery, the weight of the crown pressing on her powdered hair. She sat for hours in a grand cathedral, the air thick with candle smoke and incense, while bishops anointed her with holy oils. The oils themselves, meant to purify and sanctify, left her hair and skin sticky, clinging to powders and perfumes already in place. After the ceremony came days of banquets, endless food and drink, and nights of little rest. Behind the majesty of golden crowns and velvet robes was a body growing stiff from layers of fabric, a face itching beneath lead-based paint, and breath soured by spiced wine. Yet the people saw only a vision of glory, and the queen played her part with practiced dignity. The discomfort was hidden, smothered beneath perfumes and ceremony, just as the smells of the city were smothered beneath incense and flowers scattered on the floor of the cathedral. Superstition wound itself tightly around hygiene, shaping even the simplest acts. Some queens believed in astrologers who told them the safest days for washing. "Bathe not when the moon wanes," they warned, "lest your strength wane with it." Others prescribed special herbs to rub on the skin during certain planetary alignments, believing the stars themselves controlled cleanliness and health. Relics were also called upon. A vial of water said to have touched a saint's bones, a cloth blessed by a bishop, or even soil from a holy shrine. These were sprinkled into basins for washing or sewn into garments, not to clean the body but to cleanse the spirit. For a queen, such practices were not oddities but serious protections woven into her daily rituals. To bathe with holy water was to strengthen the womb, to rub the skin with saintly soil was to ward off plague. Modern ears may chuckle, but for medieval nobility, these gestures gave comfort in a world of uncertainty. Night returned each day, drawing queens back to their chambers, where the cycle began anew. Curtains of heavy cloth enclosed the bed, shutting out both draughts and what little fresh air might have crept in. The mattress, filled with straw and herbs, gave a softness compared to wooden benches, but over time grew lumpy, smelling faintly of mildew and sweat. Servants laid furs across the bed, tucked in sheets, and sometimes even warmed the linens with hot stones wrapped in cloth before their mistress lay down. At her bedside, a pomander rested on a chain, ready to be lifted to her nose if foul odours crept through the room. A small lamp flickered, throwing long shadows across tapestries, and the quiet sounds of the castle drifted in, the distant bark of a dog, the echo of guards on the walls, the scuttle of mice in the rafters. Sleep came slowly, layered in smells both pleasant and foul, and in the morning she awoke to the same ritual of powders, perfumes, and preparations. It was a cycle without end. Festivals and coronations, banquets and travels, beauty and sleep. Each one demanded careful disguises, careful rituals, and endless endurance. The perfumes of lavender, rose, and clove were the constant thread, weaving through her life like a veil of false freshness. Underneath, the truths of sweat, smoke, and soil lingered always. Yet the queen moved with grace, believing, perhaps even convincing herself, that she was not merely masking filth, but performing refinement. In her world, hygiene was not about cleansing, but about concealing, about balancing appearances with the strange beliefs of her time. And so she lived, day after day, night after night, wrapped in the illusions of cleanliness, crowned with jewels, powdered with flour, and perfumed with roses that could never quite drown out the world around her. Within the stone walls of the castle, grooming was an endless task, though rarely in the way we might expect. Each morning, before the queen emerged into the public eye, her attendants set about the slow ritual of readying her body for the day. Hair came first, a tangled crown of braids, powders, and often lice. Servants combed steadily, the teeth of bone combs scratching through the scalp, sometimes pulling strands so tightly that tears pricked the queen's eyes. Yet to skip the ritual was unthinkable. A well-combed head was the foundation of dignity, no matter what tiny creatures lurked unseen within it. Afterward came powders for the face, dabs of rosewater on the wrists, and the careful arranging of veils and headpieces. To us it seems like a battle against inevitability, powders against sweat, perfumes against smoke. But to the queen and her ladies, it was not a battle at all. It was order, ritual, and appearance, the daily armour of nobility. By the time she stepped into the hall, her true body, its smells, its discomforts, its flaws, was buried beneath layers of artifice. Clothing maintenance was another world of contradiction. Gowns, stitched with gold thread and pearls, were too costly to launder. Instead, they were brushed with stiff cloths, hung near windows to catch breezes or sprinkled with herbs. Linen shifts beneath bore the burden of true contact with the skin. These shifts were boiled, beaten, and scoured with lye until they whitened again, though the process frayed the fabric quickly. Servants carried baskets of soiled linens to rivers or washing yards, their own hands raw from the harsh soap. Queens rarely touched such tasks themselves, but they lived surrounded by the evidence, the piles of laundry, the smell of lye, the sight of shifts flapping on lines in castle courtyards. Every queen's beauty rested not only on her own rituals, but on the constant, unseen scrubbing done by others. The great gowns dazzled at feasts and ceremonies, but the true work of cleanliness lay hidden in steaming tubs, beaten fabrics, and the sore hands of washerwomen. Outdoors, the same struggles followed her. A queen in her garden was a vision, veils fluttering, hands brushing roses, her presence framed by neatly clipped hedges. But gardens, however orderly, were no cleaner than the rest of medieval life. Fertilizer came from manure, carried in on carts. Bees hummed among flowers, dogs bounded across paths, and chickens pecked freely. Queens and noble ladies plucked herbs to chew for their breath, tucked sprigs into their gowns, or distilled petals into rosewater. Gardens smelled sweet, yes, but also earthy, pungent, and sometimes downright unpleasant. Yet these were spaces of retreat where queens could walk away from smoky halls and noisy kitchens, inhaling the mingled scents of mint, thyme, and manure as though they were breathing paradise. On hunts, hygiene gave way to spectacle. A queen might ride side-saddle, her gown lifted to keep from dragging in the mud, a hawk perched on her gloved arm. The air was fresh in forests and fields, though it carried the odours of horses, dogs, and sweat. Meals were taken outdoors, meats roasted on spits, hands wiped on cloths or on the grass itself. Perfume clung stubbornly to veils, but it mingled now with the smell of leather saddles, horsehair, and smoke from campfires. Queens did not escape these scents. They carried them back to the castle, woven into their clothing, lingering in their hair. Once home, attendants shook out the gowns, sprinkled them with herbs, and pretended the ride had left no trace. The hunt was a performance of nobility, but also an intimate reminder that even queens lived surrounded by the same smells of the earth as peasants did. Only theirs were hidden beneath velvet and embroidery. Pilgrimages, when queens took them, were longer journeys still, and with them came the collapse of any illusion of hygiene. Travelling on horseback or in jolting wagons, they stopped at monasteries or humble inns, where bedding crawled with fleas and food was often questionable. Yet queens pressed forward, believing the hardship was holy, the discomfort part of devotion. They packed perfumed cloths, pomanders, and clean shifts, but after weeks on the road, even the most carefully guarded dignity gave way to dust, sweat, and exhaustion. By the time they reached shrines, they knelt on stone floors, offering prayers with hair powdered not only with flour, but with the grit of travel. For all their perfumes and powders, queens could not keep the world at bay. The smell of unwashed pilgrims, of beasts of burden, of smoke and incense wrapped around them like a second cloak. And yet, in those moments, it was not considered shameful, it was a badge of devotion. A queen who endured the same filth as her subjects on pilgrimage showed herself holy, even if her chambermaids despaired of ever getting the dust out of her gowns again. And still, the cycle returned, as it always did. Back in the castle, the combs emerged, the powders fell, the perfumes bloomed. Queens lay down again beneath heavy curtains, chamber pots nearby, mattresses stuffed with straw and herbs. They dreamed to the sounds of mice in the rafters, woke to the scratch of combs, endured the weight of gowns, and presented themselves anew to halls of smoke, banquets of grease, and festivals of incense. Their lives were not clean in the way we imagine today, but they were patterned, ritualized, a balance between foulness and fragrance, discomfort and grace. It was not about bathing away the world. It was about cloaking it, managing it, enduring it, and stepping each day into the hall as though roses alone clung to their skirts. For all the perfumes, powders, and elaborate veils of dignity, the truth is that some of the worst hygiene practices of royal women were not slips of negligence, but deliberate choices. Chief among these was the steadfast avoidance of bathing. Imagine a queen with gilded crowns surrounded by silks from distant lands, refusing to step into a bath, not because she lacked the means, but because she feared it would kill her. Physicians insisted that immersing the body in hot water opened the pores to dangerous airs. Cold baths, they said, could send the humours into shock. And so, rather than cleanse the body, queens cloaked it. They dabbed themselves with cloths dipped in vinegar or wine, rubbed herbs into their arms, and considered themselves protected. Weeks, sometimes months, might pass without a true bath. The powders grew thicker, the perfumes more pungent, until the body beneath was less flesh than vessel for layers of artifice. To us it seems absurd to own gilded baths and fountains yet rarely use them, but in their world, the very act of bathing was treated as reckless. Hair, too, was home to some of the most unpleasant practices. It was not simply left unwashed, it became a stage for experiments in powders and oils that created more problems than they solved. Queens sometimes rubbed animal fat into their hair to make it gleam in candlelight, only to find that it attracted dirt, dust, and every insect in the hall. To cover the smell, they shook in herbs, or worse, flour, leaving their heads looking pale and scented like an overbaked loaf. The lice combs worked tirelessly, but they could not keep up with the crawling legions. It was not unusual for queens and noble ladies to sit for hours as attendants picked lice and eggs from their hair, tossing the small carcasses into candles where they popped faintly in the flame. One wonders whether the soft crackle of burning lice became as familiar to the royal ear as the sound of lutes or harps. Another dreadful practice came from cosmetics. White skin was demanded by fashion, for it showed one did not labour under the sun. To achieve this, women smeared their faces with a paste of vinegar and lead. The lead slowly poisoned them, corroding the skin, leaving sores hidden beneath powder. But to appear pale was more important than health. Rouge for the cheeks and lips often contained cinnabar laced with mercury, which burned and discoloured the skin. Yet the brighter the red, the more admired the effect. Teeth, meanwhile, decayed quickly from sugar, leaving blackened gums. But even this, in certain courts, was reframed as a mark of wealth. See, I am rich enough to eat sugar until it ruins me. The worst hygiene was not simply tolerated, it was flaunted. A mouth of rotting teeth could be, bizarrely, a fashion statement. And what of the intimate matters? Underwear, as we think of it, was rarely worn. Queens relied on long linen shifts, which absorbed sweat and other bodily fluids. These shifts were washed more often than gowns, but not daily. In hot summers, layers clung damp against the body, stiffening as they dried, until the very fabric seemed to carry its own smell. During menstruation, linen rags were folded and tucked into place, reused after washing. Servants discreetly carried them away, but no matter how carefully scrubbed, odours lingered. Physicians even spread wild theories, declaring that menstrual blood was poisonous, that it could spoil crops or sicken animals. Imagine the tension of living in a court where your natural cycle was both hidden and feared, your body treated as dangerous, your shifts and cloths washed in silence by servants who never spoke of it aloud. Then there were the chamber pots, those glittering vessels of indignity. A queen might relieve herself into a gilded pot painted with flowers, only for a servant to carry it sloshing through corridors. Some castles had garderobes, stone alcoves where waste fell into pits or moats, but even these became foul quickly. In summer, the smell drifted through corridors, mingling with the perfumes of feasts. Queens endured this with poise, pretending not to notice, though surely the odour reached even the highest dais. The worst part was not the necessity itself, but the lack of separation. Beauty, ceremony, and filth all coexisted within the same walls. A chamber could hold velvet curtains, jewelled crowns, painted icons of saints, and beneath the bed, a chamber pot waiting to be emptied. And perhaps the most bizarre of all, the belief that sweat itself was cleansing. When physicians advised noble women to purify the body, they did not mean washing. They meant sweating. A queen might sit by a roaring fire, wrapped in heavy gowns, until sweat poured from her skin. Attendants peeled away her damp linen shift, replaced it with another, and declared her clean. No water touched her, no soap was used. Sweat was thought to drive impurities out. In the dim firelight, perhaps she believed it. But to us, the image is almost comic. A queen, dripping and flushed, sitting in her finery while her attendants nodded approvingly, praising her for sweating instead of bathing. These were not accidents, not oversights, but deliberate practices. Perfumes instead of baths, powders instead of water, lead and mercury instead of natural skin, lice combs instead of soap, gilded pots instead of sewers, sweat instead of washing. To be royal was not to be clean. It was to be perfumed, powdered, and painted into a vision of grace, even as the body beneath quietly festered. And that, perhaps, is the strangest truth of all. The worst hygiene practices were not hidden in shame, but woven proudly into the very image of queenship. Food itself was another hidden culprit in the decline of royal hygiene. Queens ate not in moderation, but in excess of delicacies that clung to the teeth and soured the breath. Sugar, still rare and costly, was consumed as though it were medicine for the spirit. Candied almonds, honeyed figs, wine thick with spices, and breads sweetened with syrups filled the royal table. For a queen, to eat such sweets was a declaration of wealth. But the aftermath was less noble, teeth blackened, gums inflamed, and breath so foul that even the strongest rosewater could not fully mask it. Tooth powders made from ashes, crushed shells, or even burnt bread were rubbed across the enamel, scratching more than cleaning. Queens smiled in portraits, their beauty immortalized in paint, while in reality they often hid rotting teeth behind painted lips. It was not only a matter of indulgence, but of ignorance. In their eyes, a darkened tooth was simply the price of elegance, even a mark of fortune. Medicine, too, brought practices that worsened rather than improved hygiene. When a queen fell ill, physicians rarely prescribed rest or fresh air. Instead, they ordered poultices smeared on the skin, made of fat, clay, or crushed herbs, which clung to the body and soaked into gowns. Sometimes the mixtures included animal dung, thought to draw out disease. The smell of these treatments mingled with perfumes, creating a confusing haze around the patient. Bloodletting was common, leeches placed on delicate arms, cups pressed to skin until crimson drops filled them. The wounds were rarely cleaned in ways we would expect. Instead, a cloth dabbed with wine or vinegar was pressed against the skin, and the queen was told she was purified. To her, this was healing. To us, it seems another layer of grime, another ritual of filth disguised as medicine. Cosmetics, already hazardous, brought their own share of grotesque beauty secrets. To keep the face smooth, some queens applied masks of raw egg whites, left to dry into a crackling film that tightened the skin but left behind a faint odor of sulfur. Others rubbed snail slime or mixtures of animal fats across their cheeks, hoping for youth. To brighten the eyes, some dabbed drops of wine or even vinegar, stinging the delicate tissue but leaving them temporarily reddened and lively. The pursuit of beauty often meant layering foul-smelling, toxic or uncomfortable substances across the skin until it no longer resembled the fresh youth it was meant to preserve. Attendants nodded approvingly, courtiers praised the queen's glow, but the truth beneath was a face burning with poison, painted in lead, rouged in mercury, and powdered in chalk. Even their gowns carried hygiene nightmares. Embroidered with pearls, stitched with golden thread, or lined with fur, they were never washed. Instead, they absorbed odours with every banquet, every procession, every crowded hall. Servants brushed them, shook them, and sprinkled them with crushed herbs, but the fabric itself carried the memory of every feast and fire. In winter, fur linings grew damp and matted, trapping sweat against the body. In summer, the weight of fabric caused sweat to pour, soaking into linen shifts that hardened as they dried. Yet gowns were prized not for comfort or cleanliness, but for spectacle. A queen's gown could weigh 20 pounds, a tapestry of splendour that disguised the reality of the body beneath. She stood radiant in the hall, her perfume cloud carefully arranged, while under the silk her linen shift clung damp, her hair itched with lice, and her skin stung from powders. The chamber itself became a stage for bad hygiene. Floors were covered with rushes, grasses and herbs meant to soak up spills and smells. At first, they were fresh and fragrant, but as days passed, food scraps, grease and chamber pot accidents soaked into them. Insects nested, mice scurried, and the rushes grew foul long before they were replaced. A queen walking across her own chamber felt the soft crunch of filth beneath her slippers, her skirts brushing against rushes that had long since given up their freshness. Yet to medieval eyes, the herbs were symbols of refinement, a touch of nature indoors, a sweet cover for what lay beneath. The very thing meant to clean was instead a carpet of hidden rot. And always, the perfumes. They were the crowning illusion, the invisible armour. Queens were rarely without their pomanders, golden spheres filled with cloves, cinnamon, and dried roses. They dabbed rosewater onto their wrists, poured lavender into basins, and rubbed vinegar into cloths to purify the air. Yet these scents, far from cleansing, often mingled with the odours they tried to conceal. The result was not roses alone, but roses mixed with sweat, herbs tangled with smoke, cloves battling against the stench of waste. For the queen, this was victory. The smell of filth had been transformed, disguised, made bearable. But for us, the thought of layers upon layers of masking scents is almost dizzying. The worst hygiene practice of all was not the filth itself, but the endless effort to cloak it, to pretend it was not there. Nighttime was perhaps the most revealing. When the queen slipped into her bed, the curtains were drawn close, the chamber pot slid into place, and the perfumes of the day lingered in the air. She lay on straw stuffed with herbs, her head resting on linen that bore the faint smell of sweat and rosewater, her hair powdered white with flour, her face painted still with lead and rouge. To the world outside she was majesty incarnate, but within those curtains she was a woman wrapped in the strangest contradictions of her age: luxury and filth, perfume and lice, jewels and chamber pots, power and poison. It is in that contrast that the worst hygiene practices of royal women become clear. They were not the absence of effort, but the presence of too much of the wrong effort, beliefs that turned filth into fashion, perfume into health, and sweat into cleansing. Banquets, those glittering shows of wealth, never truly smelled as they looked. On the long wooden tables, golden platters groaned beneath roasted swans, pies filled with minced meats, and flagons of spiced wine. Courtiers laughed, musicians played, and poets praised the elegance of the queen. But beneath the poetry, grease clung to the air, spilled ale seeped into the rushes, and the perfume of cloves and lavender had to fight for dominance. The queen, radiant in jewels, lifted her goblet as if the hall were perfumed with roses alone. Yet her fingers grew sticky from sugared almonds, her lips tinged with wine that left her breath heavy, and her gown, though dazzling, absorbed the odours of the feast. When she retired, attendants shook the cloth, brushed it with herbs, and declared it fresh, though the fabric carried a memory of grease that perfumes could never fully erase. Banquets were the essence of majesty, but also the quiet heart of filth. Beauty was a full-time mask, and perhaps the clearest mirror of royal women's worst hygiene practices. In her chamber, by candlelight, the queen sat before a polished metal mirror while ladies applied powders and pastes. A smear of vinegar and lead across the cheeks gave her the pale glow of refinement, even as it slowly poisoned the skin. Rouge of cinnabar painted her lips crimson, even as it burned. Perfumed oils dabbed across her wrists promised grace, but the animal fats beneath gave an undertone all their own. Her hair, powdered with flour until it gleamed pale, carried not only scent, but vermin. A lice comb scratched dutifully through the strands, while servants dropped the tiny invaders into candle flames. And yet, when she entered the hall, no one saw the lice, the sores, or the harsh powder. They saw only radiance. To achieve that radiance, queens endured hours of discomfort, the very rituals of beauty becoming some of the worst offences against hygiene. Sleep, though, was where illusion gave way. When the torches guttered low and the castle grew still, the queen withdrew behind curtains drawn thick around her bed. The straw mattress creaked as she lay down, the herbs within releasing faint scents of thyme and lavender mingled with mildew. Beside her, the chamber pot waited, discreetly hidden yet inescapably present. She closed her eyes, her body wrapped in linen shifts still damp with sweat, her hair powdered stiff with flour, her face still bearing traces of paste and rouge. Around her, the air held the faint perfume of rosewater, but also the honest smell of a lived-in chamber. Smoke from the hearth, grease from the feast, waste from the pot. Sleep was not the soft dream we imagine, but a surrender within an atmosphere of contradictions. She drifted off, her majesty intact, but her body surrounded by the same human realities her perfumes always tried to conceal. The chamber itself was a lesson in hidden filth. Floors covered with rushes appeared fresh only on the first day when green herbs were scattered generously. By the end of the week, grease from banquets, ashes from fires, and spills from chamber pots had soaked into them. Insects thrived in the layers, and small creatures scurried beneath the cover. Servants replaced the rushes eventually, but not before their smells became part of the air. The queen's skirts, brushing across the floor, picked up the memory of every feast and accident. To guests, the chamber was splendid, lined with tapestries and hung with silks. To those who lived within it, the stench was a quiet companion, managed with perfumes and ignored with grace. The very floor of the queen's chamber was, quite literally, a patchwork of rot disguised as comfort. Perfumes were the constant refrain, the shield that turned the worst hygiene into something bearable. Queens carried pomanders filled with cloves and cinnamon, dabbed rosewater on their wrists, burned incense in their chambers, and steeped linens in lavender. These scents did not remove filth, they overpowered it. They mingled with smoke, sweat, and waste until the air itself was thick with contradictions. It was roses mixed with manure, lavender tangled with mildew, cloves battling grease. Yet for the queen, this was not deception, but wisdom. She believed perfume could protect against disease, could shield her from foul airs, could preserve her health. In truth, it preserved only the illusion of cleanliness. The worst hygiene practice was not neglect, but substitution, choosing perfume instead of washing, powders instead of bathing, illusions instead of reality. Food habits, too, cycled endlessly into hygiene's decline. A queen's teeth, once white in youth, darkened with each candied fruit and spiced wine. Powders of crushed bone and vinegar rinses only scratched and eroded them further. Smiles became rarer, lips painted red to disguise decay. Attendants whispered remedies, chewing fennel, gargling with wine, rinsing with urine. Some were endured, others avoided, but none restored freshness. At banquets, queens smiled anyway, the perfume of cloves pressed close to their lips, even as their breath betrayed the truth. Wealth fed the feast, but it also rotted the mouth. And so the cycle returned again and again. Banquets, beauty, chambers, perfumes, sleep. Each one revealed not only the elegance of royalty, but also its hidden grime. Queens lived not in sparkling purity, but in layers of substitution. Sweat treated as cleansing, powders treated as skincare, perfumes treated as health. Their lives were a pageant of illusions, a careful balance of appearance and endurance. And beneath it all, the worst hygiene practices were not accidents. They were traditions, beliefs, and fashions woven proudly into the very image of majesty. Banquets, though celebrated as marvels of abundance, were also theatres of mess. The tables, though covered with white linens, quickly grew stained with wine, grease, and sauces. Trenchers of stale bread, used as plates, soaked up gravy until they sagged. then were discarded to dogs or peasants. Hands, sticky with meats and sweets, were wiped casually on cloths that served dozens or on the skirts of garments that would not see water for months. For the queen, this was no less true. She sipped from her jewelled goblet, dipped bread into thick sauces, and smiled at the hall, while her fingers grew tacky and her teeth caught crumbs of candied fruits. After the feast, she rose gracefully, perfumes pressed against her nose, her gown heavy with odours. Servants brushed and shook the fabric, but the faint smell of roasted meats lingered, woven into silk like a secret memory of every banquet that had passed before. The worst hygiene was not the feast itself, but the absence of cleansing that followed. Beauty, pursued at all costs, continued to betray the body it claimed to exalt. A queen's face, pale with lead, grew brittle, her skin breaking beneath the layers of poison. Yet powders were reapplied, each morning a new mask painted over yesterday's sores. To darken her brows, soot might be rubbed into the hairs, leaving a faint smell of ash lingering near her temples. To scent her breath, she chewed cloves or fennel seeds, briefly disguising decay, but never curing it. Her hair, gleaming with flour or dusted with herbs, carried lice that thrived no matter how many combs scratched through. Still, the finished image was dazzling. Pale skin, red lips, powdered hair, perfumed garments. The contradiction was part of the majesty. Queens embodied beauty not by cleansing the body, but by layering it until no truth could be seen. Sleep, that nightly retreat, was hardly a reprieve from bad hygiene. The queen's bed, grand with curtains and furs, was filled with straw that grew musty and damp. Servants scattered herbs within, so that when she lay down, she inhaled lavender, thyme, and the mildew of old straw together. Furs trapped warmth in winter, but also trapped sweat, carrying it from night to night. Beneath the bed, the chamber pot waited, sometimes unemptied until morning, its smell mingling with the air behind the curtains. Queens, too, woke to the sound of scurrying rats in the rushes and the faint scent of smoke from the hearth clinging to their hair and gowns. Sleep was wrapped not only in silks, but in the smells of waste, smoke, and sweat. The worst hygiene practice here was not neglect. It was the belief that this was luxury, that heavy curtains and perfumed herbs could transform filth into refinement. The chambers themselves were layers of deception. Tapestries covered the damp stone walls, beautiful to behold but lined with dust and mites. Floors covered with rushes quickly soured, the herbs sprinkled among them crushed underfoot into a paste of grease and ash. Chamber pots were carried out, but accidents happened, and sometimes the rushes themselves were treated as a convenient convenience. Servants replaced them when they grew too foul, but in the days between, insects and vermin thrived. Queens lived amid this, pretending the perfume of rosemary masked the truth. The chamber to visitors was splendid. To its mistress, it was a daily lesson in endurance. The worst hygiene here was structural, built into the very castle itself, a world where beauty and filth coexisted by design. Perfumes, the eternal answer to every problem, turned into their own form of excess. Rosewater was splashed until gowns dripped with it. Lavender sachets were stuffed into sleeves and incense burned in corners until smoke clouded the air. The queen carried her pomander, lifting it to her nose whenever the hall grew too rank. Yet perfumes did not cleanse, they mixed. A banquet hall smelled not of roses, but of roses on top of grease, cloves tangled with smoke, lavender layered upon waste. For queens, this was success. The foulness had been made bearable. For us, the thought of such dense clouds of competing scents is dizzying. The worst hygiene practice here was not a lack of effort, but too much effort misdirected. An endless drowning of filth in fragrance until fragrance itself became oppressive. Food habits returned again, repeating their toll. Sweets blackened the teeth, wines soured the breath, meats left grease on fingers that cloths never fully removed. Remedies were endless but inadequate. Urine rinses, vinegar gargles, burnt bread powders. Attendants swore these worked, queens endured them patiently, and the cycle continued. Each feast was another step toward decay, another invitation for perfumes to take up their impossible battle. Queens smiled through it, the decay hidden behind rouge, the smell softened by cloves, the truth buried beneath the illusions of wealth. And so the cycle stretched on. Banquets staining gowns, powders poisoning faces, perfumes masking waste, chambers hiding filth, beds trapping sweat. Each practice was not merely unhygienic, but celebrated, wrapped into the identity of royalty itself. Queens endured lice and rot not as shame, but as normality, their endurance a mark of nobility. To be royal was not to be clean, it was to be endlessly powdered, perfumed and praised, even as the body beneath quietly decayed. Banquets returned like seasons, a rhythm of grease and grandeur. The hall glowed with torchlight, shadows dancing across tapestries, while platters of roasted peacocks and boars' heads were carried in with ceremony. The queen sat tall, veils framing her powdered face, her hands bejewelled, her every movement watched. Yet the elegance masked a mess. Fingers plucked meats, sauces dripped, and sweet wines clung to lips. Trenchers of bread sagged with grease, discarded beneath the tables where dogs and servants fought for scraps. The rushes underfoot grew slick, saturated with spills until they gave off a pungent odour. Still, the queen raised her pomander to her nose and smiled serenely, as though the hall smelled only of roses. Servants later brushed her gown, sprinkling herbs to disguise the feast that clung to its folds, but the fabric remembered. Each garment carried faint echoes of meals past, a patchwork of grease hidden beneath perfume. Beauty was, in truth, a discipline of disguises. Queens endured hours of preparation each morning, their faces painted into perfection. White lead paste cracked across cheeks, thick enough to hide blemishes but brittle enough to flake if she smiled too broadly. Rouge burned upon the lips, cinnabar bright as blood, yet laced with poison. Hair gleamed with powders that stiffened it like plaster, drawing attention while feeding lice. Attendants plucked, combed and painted until the queen's body no longer resembled itself, but became an image, radiance forged by artifice. Behind closed doors, she might itch, ache, or feel faint from the heaviness of her attire. But in public, she was beauty incarnate. The worst hygiene lay not in neglect, but in this strange dedication to poisons and powders, a beauty bought by discomfort and decay. Sleep, though precious, brought no escape. Curtains closed tightly, trapping not only warmth but also odours of the day. The mattress, stuffed with straw, released faint herbal scents when disturbed, lavender or mint sprinkled by servants, but these mingled with mildew that no perfume could banish. Furs grew matted from sweat, thick and heavy in winter, sticky in summer. Beside the bed, the chamber pot waited. At night, the queen lay with powdered hair pressed into her pillow, her face still carrying traces of lead and rouge, her breath thick with wine and cloves. She drifted into dreams not of roses and silks, but into the mingled scents of herbs, smoke, and waste. Even her most private sanctuary was bound to the cycle of concealment. Herbs disguising mildew, perfumes cloaking sweat, curtains hiding the truth. The chamber itself told the story best. Tapestries decorated the walls, their colours rich, their scenes grand. But their folds held dust, mites, and the faint damp of stone. Rushes covered the floors, strewn with flowers and herbs at first, only to rot into filth as days wore on. Mice scurried, insects crawled, and spills of grease or ale seeped into the layers. Servants replaced them when they grew unbearable, but for days at a time, the chamber smelled of a damp meadow trampled underfoot. Queens walked gracefully through, their slippers brushing against filth they pretended not to notice, their heads held high as though the air were clean. The grandeur of the chamber was undeniable, yet it was grandeur laid over decay, a mask that fooled only those who chose to believe. Perfumes were the queen's constant companions, both shield and prison. Rosewater splashed across linen, lavender sewn into pouches, incense burned until smoke curled into every corner. Queens clutched pomanders, golden balls filled with cloves and herbs, holding them to their noses in banquets, processions, and even in their own chambers. Perfumes were thought not only to please, but to protect, guarding against disease carried on foul air. The queen lived within a permanent haze, her every breath laced with spice and flower. Yet the scents never truly replaced the smells they hid. Instead, they mingled, creating a bouquet of contradictions: roses and sweat, lavender and mildew, cloves and waste. The worst hygiene practice here was the reliance on perfume as medicine, as cleanliness, as defense. It was illusion, but one so carefully woven that queens themselves believed it. Food itself betrayed hygiene further. Candied fruits, rich pastries, and spiced wines coated the teeth, darkening them year by year. Tooth powders of ashes or crushed shells offered little help, scratching more than cleaning. Mouthwashes of vinegar or even urine promised freshness, though only for a fleeting moment. Queens smiled carefully, lips painted to disguise decay, while attendants whispered remedies that offered no true relief. A mouth filled with rot was hidden behind rouge, a breath soured by sugar masked with cloves. At banquets, no one dared remark on the reality. To point out decay was to insult majesty, and so courtiers praised her beauty as though her smile were unblemished. The worst hygiene here was the silence, a collective agreement to pretend rot was radiance. And so the cycle stretched longer still. Banquets, stained gowns, beauty-poisoned skin, perfumes cloaked waste, chambers rotted beneath herbs, food darkened teeth, sleep-trapped odours in curtains. Queens lived not apart from filth, but within it, shaping it, disguising it, elevating it into ritual. To modernize, their hygiene seems appalling, their practices absurd. But to them, it was refinement, medicine, even holiness. They believed themselves protected, purified, preserved, even as the reality beneath grew worse. Childbirth, though cloaked in sanctity, was perhaps one of the most unhygienic chapters in a queen's life. The birthing chamber was sealed tight, windows shuttered and doors closed to keep out what physicians called evil airs. Instead of fresh breezes, the room filled with the heat of burning braziers, the smoke of candles, and the sweat of anxious attendants. Herbs were scattered on the floor to purify the air, though they quickly grew damp underfoot. The queen laboured for hours, or days, swaddled in layers of cloth, attendants pressing spiced wine to her lips, cloths dipped in vinegar dabbed against her brow. Water was rarely used. Instead, wine or oils served as cleaning agents. Once the infant arrived, both mother and child were swaddled tightly, their bodies rarely washed, for physicians feared that exposure to water in these vulnerable moments would invite illness. The chamber, filled with smoke, sweat and blood, must have been overwhelming, yet to those present it was considered holy, even healing. The worst hygiene practice here was not ignorance, but deliberate ritual, sealing off fresh air, avoiding washing, and cloaking reality beneath layers of herbs and incense. Seasons, too, dictated hygiene in ways both comic and tragic. In summer, the heat trapped within castle walls was unbearable. Sweat poured beneath layers of linen and velvet, perfumes thickened in the air, and insects flourished in the rushes. Queens dabbed themselves with cloths soaked in rosewater, held sprigs of mint beneath their noses, and fanned themselves desperately while attendants shook out their gowns in vain attempts to freshen them. The very air seemed to grow heavy with damp and odour. In winter, the pendulum swung the other way. The cold cut through stone halls, frost formed on window panes, and water froze in basins. Bathing, already feared, was abandoned altogether, for cold water was considered dangerous to the body. Queens wrapped themselves in layer upon layer of furs, trapping sweat beneath. Smoke from hearth fires clung to hair, clothes, and skin until every chamber smelled of burning wood and damp wool. Herbs were scattered, perfumes poured, but still the smell of winter lingered. Half smoke, half sweat. The worst hygiene practice here was the refusal to adapt, to cleanse. Instead, each season simply demanded new ways to disguise discomfort. Travel only magnified these realities. When queens left their castles for progressions or pilgrimages, they carried their filth with them. Carriages jolted over rutted roads, shaking straw bedding into dust, veils fluttering with grime. Inns along the way were smoky, crowded, their bedding crawling with fleas. Even monasteries offered no true escape. Shared dormitories were filled with the odours of pilgrims, the stale smell of straw, the ever-present tang of unwashed bodies. Queens brought their own linens, their own perfumes, their own chamber pots, but even so, the journey left its mark. By the time they arrived at a shrine or festival, their gowns were dulled with dust, their hair tangled with grit, their perfumes doing battle with sweat and smoke. Pilgrimage was holy, but it was also dirty, filth embraced as part of devotion. The worst hygiene here was not accidental but expected. Queens endured vermin and dust as proof of their humility, even while trying to mask it with rosewater and gold. And then, inevitably, the cycle returned. Banquets, with their grease and feasting, left gowns stained and air heavy. Beauty rituals, with their poisonous powders and strange pastes, turned the body itself into a paradox of radiance and rot. Chambers, lined with damp tapestries and rushes, grew foul beneath their finery. Perfumes, cloying and constant, layered sweetness over decay without ever cleansing it away. Sleep, behind heavy curtains, was not a retreat from filth, but a chambered echo of it, herbs and mildew mingling in the air while chamber pots sat waiting. Day after day, night after night, queens lived in the same cycle, convinced that they were preserving their health, their beauty, their dignity, even as their practices deepened the filth they wished to escape. Food habits pressed the cycle on. Sweet cakes, candied fruits, and spiced wines blackened teeth and soured breath. Remedies like vinegar gargles, urine rinses, and burnt bread powders scratched at the problem without solving it. Still, queens smiled in public, lips painted red, courtiers praising their beauty as if decay did not exist. Their gowns dazzled, their jewels sparkled, their perfumes clung sweetly to the air. But beneath it all, the evidence of their worst hygiene remained. To modernize, the habits seem shocking, even laughable. But to medieval royalty, they were not lapses but wisdom. Perfume was medicine, sweat was cleansing, and paint was protection. The worst hygiene practices were not hidden mistakes, but proud traditions wrapped in ritual and reinforced by belief. Banquets, though celebrated in song and story, were sensory onslaughts where hygiene was never invited to dine. The queen sat at the high table, draped in velvet, her powdered face serene as roasted meats steamed before her. Yet hands reached across dishes, fingers greasy, goblets shared between lips, crumbs tumbling into the rushes below. The very air of the hall became thick with smoke, grease, sweat, and wine, heavy enough to cling to the fabrics of gowns and veils. Candles dripped wax onto platters, dogs barked underfoot, and servants wove through the chaos with dripping trenchers. By the night's end, the queen's once fresh perfume was battered by odours of roasting fat, stale ale, and singed tallow. When she rose, courtiers bowed, praising her elegance, while her gown whispered the truth in faint stains and smells woven deep into the cloth. Banquets were not only feasts of wealth but of grime, absorbed and disguised, but never truly cleansed. Beauty rituals, relentless and ritualized, only added to the layers of filth. Morning began with powders of chalk or flour shaken onto hair, settling into roots already crawling with lice. Combs scratched and picked, attendants muttering softly, their fingers plucking out tiny invaders one by one, dropping them into the flames to crackle faintly. Rouge painted the lips, cinnabar brightening cheeks, while the poisonous paste of lead gave the face its pale, ghostly glow. Attendants added perfume oils, sweet at first, but they mingled with the residue of sweat and the smoke of the hearth. Queens endured all this patiently, believing these rituals elevated them above common folk. In reality, they created faces painted with poison, hair heavy with powder, and bodies fragrant only by illusion. The worst hygiene was not absence of effort, but misdirected effort, devotion to practices that slowly rotted the very body they sought to glorify. Chambers, richly adorned, revealed their secrets in silence. Tapestries hung proudly on damp stone, heavy with dust and mites that servants beat only occasionally. Floors covered with rushes seemed soft and fresh when first scattered, but quickly turned into mats of grease and decay as scraps, wine, and waste seeped into their fibres. Insects thrived there, crawling unseen, while rodents darted boldly across corners. Chamber pots, painted with flowers and gilded with gold, sat beneath benches, carried out in haste each morning, but never erasing the lingering smell. Queens walked across the rushes, skirts brushing what lay hidden, pretending not to notice. Guests marvelled at the richness of tapestries, the brilliance of jewels, never suspecting that just beneath the silken sheen was the stale smell of mildew, sweat, and ash. Castles impressed the eye but never deceived the nose. Perfumes were their salvation, their armour, and their prison. Rosewater poured over cloths until they dripped, lavender sachets crammed into bodices, incense burned until smoke clouded every chamber. Queens clutched pomanders, golden cages filled with cloves and cinnamon, holding them discreetly at banquets or openly in crowded streets. To them, perfume was not only refinement, but medicine, believed to guard against sickness carried on foul air. Yet perfumes never erased odours, they multiplied them. A hall smelled not of roses alone, but of roses tangled with smoke, cloves battling the stench of waste, lavender layered over grease. The queen lived in constant perfume fog, breathing illusions, convincing herself that sweetness meant safety. The worst hygiene here was faith itself, the belief that perfumes cleansed more than they concealed. Sleep, sought as a reprieve, was instead another chapter in the cycle. The queen retired behind thick curtains, drawn to block draughts, but trapping odours within. Her mattress, stuffed with straw, creaked as she lay down, releasing faint scents of herbs mingled with damp mildew. Furs warmed her in winter, but they carried the sweat of many nights. The chamber pot, tucked nearby, shared its presence with every breath. Hair powdered with flour brushed against the pillow, leaving pale smudges, while rouge and lead rubbed into sheets that servants later shook out in courtyards. Queens closed their eyes in chambers that were equal parts luxury and filth, silks, herbs, and perfumes disguising mildew, sweat, and waste. Sleep was not escape, but endurance, another moment in the endless performance of concealment. Childbirth reintroduced hygiene at its worst. The queen's chamber, sealed against fresh air, grew heavy with heat, smoke, and sweat. Attendants wiped her brow with vinegar-soaked cloths, pressed spiced wine to her lips, and whispered prayers while the air thickened with incense. When the infant arrived, both mother and child were swaddled tightly, their bodies rarely washed. The chamber, littered with herbs and smoke, smelled of blood and candle wax, yet it was hailed as holy. Physicians advised against washing, against draughts, against fresh air. To them, cleanliness was danger, while filth wrapped in ritual was safety. For the queen, childbirth was survival within a haze of odours, endured with grace because it was framed as sanctity. Seasons circled these rituals endlessly. Summer heat pressed sweat into every layer, perfumes thickened, and insects swarmed in rushes. Queens dabbed rosewater to cool themselves, fans of herbs brushing their faces, while attendants shook out gowns that clung damp and heavy. Winter brought smoke and frost, queens wrapped in furs until sweat pooled beneath, while every chamber smelled of damp wool and wood smoke. Bathing, already rare, became unthinkable in cold months, and perfumes bore the burden of seasons. Each shift, each cloak, each chamber was not renewed but covered, and covered again. Travel, too, returned as a test of dignity amid grime. Roads jolted the carriages, dust clung to veils, and inns offered only smoky rooms with flea-ridden bedding. Queens brought their own linens, their own perfumes, their own chamber pots, but even so, travel stained gowns with dust and sweat. By the time they reached shrines or festivals, they were perfumed pilgrims, wrapped in devotion and dirt alike. They endured not only out of necessity but pride, for pilgrimage was proof of faith, even if it meant returning with gowns dulled, hair tangled, and perfumes nearly defeated. And always, the cycle returned. Banquets spread grease, beauty painted poison, chambers hid decay, perfumes cloaked waste, sleep trapped filth behind curtains, childbirth sealed air away, seasons smothered with smoke or sweat, travel added dust and vermin. Queens lived not in cleanliness, but in constant disguise, each day another performance of illusions. The worst hygiene practices of royal women were not accidents. They were traditions upheld with pride, repeated with confidence, praised as wisdom, even as they layered filth beneath finery. So tonight, as you rest, remember, not even queens and princesses lived in sparkling cleanliness. They wore perfume clouds like armor, fought endless battles with lice, and smiled bravely through toothaches. The medieval era was full of grandeur, but also full of smells, powders, and very questionable remedies. Let the absurdity of it all lull you into calm. Imagine yourself drifting through a candlelit castle, hearing the rustle of gowns, the clink of goblets, and perhaps catching a faint whiff of lavender covering something far less pleasant. History is strange, funny, and just boring enough to make your eyelids heavy. So breathe out slowly, and let the odd hygiene habits of royal women carry you into dreams. Good night, listener. Good night from Yawn Bay Historian.